My name is Milosz Staszewski, and today I will be partnered by Mateusz Duc and our colleague Jolanta Soja. Jolanta and I, we are both working for K7, a Wrocław-based boutique app development company. We are also Apple certified trainers for technical and programming tracks, although I have to strictly emphasize that this presentation has not been in any way endorsed by Apple. This is outside of the regular Apple training, okay? So today, together with Mateusz and Jola, I will have the honor to discuss with you the accessibility on iOS, on our mobile platforms. But I would like to present it in a way that will focus on the two perspectives, because I would assume that, well, maybe let me check that. Who of you is a developer here? Nice one. Who has provided some accessibility support on any Apple platform? Okay, so the right crowd to be here, and we often find ourselves in a similar situation, but as you probably have heard, and especially recently, these days, people are thinking about accessibility because of the legal requirements, especially regarding this very recent event of the Domino's Pizza case. Has any one of you heard about Domino's Pizza case? This is the legal ruling of this month. It happened like 2 weeks ago that the Supreme Court in America, in the United States, declined to decline the case between Domino's Pizza and Mr. Guillermo Robles, who sued Domino's because their app has not been accessible enough. And in America, there is a legal act called Americans with Disabilities Act that supposedly requires entities based in the US to provide accessibility features in their web interfaces and on mobile devices. And this is the whole legal spat, because the law came in the 90s, and Domino's says that it was too early in the 90s. They didn't even think about mobile platforms. It wasn't even invented back there, right? But the users are holding the strong case that it doesn't matter. If the act requires you to provide the accessibility features on the currently available technologies, without which you would be, in a way, put outside of the public scope of services, then you need to provide the accessibility features, no matter if the technology changes over time. So this is the US case, and if you have any US-based clients, you have probably heard about this, or you will hear about this during the next few weeks, because everyone in the States at the moment got a bit more nervous about all of this stuff. And in Europe, like in here, we have our own regulations. For example, there is the EU Web Accessibility Directive that covers both the web accessibility features and mobile devices-based accessibility features. And just to mention one more thing and go outside of this legalese stuff, you probably, if you are interested or providing accessibility features, you have probably also heard about the web content accessibility guidelines that are the basis for the most regulations around the world in different geos, in different jurisdictions, right? So when we think in our industry about accessibility, especially today, we very often are forced to provide accessibility features. But you know the story. There's always the stick and the carrot. So this is the stick. And let's don't focus on this, right? Because it's not the most convenient part for us. And this is the carrot. This is our user. And when you are working on our platforms, on Apple platforms, you have probably heard that Apple thinks that technology is most powerful when it empowers everyone, when it can be used by everyone, right? And when you are providing solutions, when you are providing apps, you probably go after the largest amount of users available from the market perspective. So this is the one thing, right? But on the other hand, just for the sake of doing it, you'd probably like all of these features, or all of these users feel welcomed, on your solution, on your app, right? And today, with Mateusz, I would like to present you the other side of the story that is usually not so clearly available and visible in your development lab. We have seen this with Jolanta time and time again, that we have developers who follow the guidelines provided by the platform vendor, how to implement the features, what is guaranteed, how it works, etc., right? But then we see users, like Mateusz, who still struggle to use your apps. So today, we would like to present you these two perspectives, and I would like just to mention at the beginning that we will present you with some of the technical stuff that you may not be so familiar with. It may seem for you a bit fast-paced, but do not worry. If it seems too fast for you, just try to look after the patterns. Try to remember how should it be done, right? And then when you will go throughout the documentation, you will know what to look for and how to implement it, right? Okay, so I asked about the developers. Who of you develops specifically for Apple platforms? Okay, and of those, no, keep the hands in the air, okay? Of those of you who has specifically worked on accessibility technologies during the last 6 months? Okay, so some of you, okay, great, okay. Thanks. As you probably know, there are various ways in which your users can struggle with the technology. There are people with cognitive, motor, vision, and hearing problems. And today, with Mateusz, we will just focus on those visually impaired. So we will only go after the vision. But most of the technologies that you will see will handle all of the cases, right? Although we will give you some cues related to the visually impaired crowd. And keep in mind that even in Poland, if you really took the road and checked how many people here in this country struggle with vision, as I am clearly, right? And I see that some of you are also developers, right? You count those people in millions, even in Poland, right? And when you look at the larger scale, there is even more. So it's really, really, really important. And most of the stuff that we will relate to will apply to all of the Apple platforms, although we will emphasize iOS, okay? So specifically the iPhone. iPhone, out of the box, comes with several technologies that assist our users. Things like dynamic type, things like voiceover, things like switch control, or our newest, how to call it? Newest child, let's call it like this, voice control. Apple is really proud of this. Okay, so we will go throughout those that are related to vision impaired users. And without the further ado and without all of this theoretical stuff, let's start with the first example. We will present you some of the demo apps. They have been created just for the sake of the demo here today. And the first one will be the audio player. And this audio player at first, we will present it to you in a way that it will be generated automatically by the OS with the mechanism that Apple gives you out of the box. Okay, so just let me switch the screen to Mateusz and Jolanta. And now, if we could present the audio player, the wrong one. So up to you, Mateusz, and okay. Jolanta, please keep showing the screen.
Okay.
It's up to you, Mateusz, now. Please launch the audio player.
Okay. I want presentation first application, which is not accessibility good. Because this application hasn't got a good labels for voiceover. these labels is not good for VoiceOver because I cannot view option in application and not can use this application powerful. But this is not a critical problem because I can make new labels. Presented this. Okay. Okay, made guess and show new window where I can change label name. I write new name label. Okay, I accept it. Changing. And this label is changing. This label I can change it with full view person, which support me. Okay.
So this was the wrong one. This is the state of the app that you get out of the box, and we'll go through with the details on what's going on here in a minute. Okay. And could we now launch the improved version?
Okay. Improve application and a good version application which has good labels. Okay, one moment. Dobra wersja, nie. Okay. In this version application, I can use all button and I know which button what do and use all option in application. Okay.
Okay. So now for a moment let's sum up what happened on the screen.
Okay.
Okay. What Mateusz essentially showed you in the first example was what you get as the developer out of the box. Our frameworks provide you some of the accessibility support without any effort on the developer side. So, for example, accessibility labels are being generated automatically for you, and they use the text that can be found, for example, in a button, right? And you would assume that it conveys the context, because it's the same thing that I usually use, even if I'm not the accessibility dependent user, right? I see the button, I see what it says, so probably they should be fine with this, if it says the same thing, right? Well, yeah, it works to some extent. This is all what the platform vendor can do for you automatically. But as Mateusz has mentioned already, there are some quirks to it. Have you noticed that Mateusz tried to define his own labels? Because the provided ones, the automatically generated ones, were not enough for him. They didn't provide enough of context. Have you ever used curtain mode on an iPhone? Do you know what curtain mode is? You can, as a trial, and you can do the same thing on Mac. Most of these mechanisms go throughout all of our platforms. You can enable something we call curtain mode, and it will essentially disable your screen. You will use your device without sight, and you will navigate it using gestures, using other commands, like voice commands, for example, since recent releases of our OSs, right? And if you are a developer, if you ever touch accessibility-based code, I highly encourage you to try to use first your own app for like an hour in a curtain mode, and then try to use the whole OS, the whole device, and try to get the experience. Because when you are developing software for visually impaired crowd, but you do see on your own sometimes you assume that there is more context than there really is. Because, for example, when in apps like this one, when you see those buttons here, we do generate for you some of the labeling, and we do it automatically. But if we can't get enough context, for example, we have like fast forward or rewind, but it isn't clearly set here, right? You probably heard about SF symbols, our great new suite of glyphs. They are really nice, but when you quite often embed them in your app, right, we do not know, as the platform provider, in which context you use them. So we describe them using the name of the glyph. And now put yourself in Mateusz's shoes, and you hear the name of the glyph, like R15 or something like that. Does it convey the right context? Of course not. And this is just the one thing. And sometimes the more scary stuff comes to the surface when you do not provide the correct labeling yourself. You are based on the automatically generated ones. And do you have any idea what do we put as an automatically generated accessibility labeling for the graphics that you provide? What can we use then? File names. We use file names of the developer resources. And you can probably assume that in some scenarios, they are really scary and they do not convey any context at all, right? So we try as a platform vendor to provide you with some of the accessibility options that we can find out for ourselves in an automated manner. But you should keep in mind that there is a work to be done on your side also. In this screen, we also have two additional UI elements that can be problematic. This would be this slider over here and this graphic file there. With the slider, our screen reader technology, VoiceOver, will inform the user, and it could be heard when Mateusz tried to change it, that we change the amount of the slider, right? We change the value. But if you launch the app and there are several sliders, right? And you do not provide the concrete labeling, the user is out of context. The user does not know what he or she in fact changes, right? So even here, even though we have only one slider and the context of the app is clearly in its name, audio player, right? You should provide the correct labeling. And when it comes to graphics, it's even worse. Why? Because in the world of people who are not dependent on accessibility-related features, you put a lot of graphics, a lot of resources, and some of them convey the real meaning, the meaning that has a value for the way app works and behaves. But the rest, the large amount of graphics that you use, is only for, let's say, artisanal value. That, make no mistake, Mateusz doesn't really care about. He wants to get the context, right? Therefore, artwork is not accessible at all. We do not support labeling, automatically generated labeling for artwork, because it would be too much, it would be too crowded for the folks using accessibility stuff. And if you did not provide the correct labeling, it would even bring the worst effect. It would be crowded with those developer resources names. What could possibly go wrong, right? So there is no support for the artwork out of the box. You have to provide it all by yourself. And as we can see, the default behavior that we do generate the naming of the buttons, the naming of the text fields using the text that is being displayed to all of us. So it works somehow, but it is not pleasant, and sometimes it's really painful to use. Let's see if we can anyhow improve on that. Let's start with emphasizing that UIKit is providing you some of the context, as we have already said, but some of you very often think about UIKit, our main framework or iOS, as the, let's say, the simple toolkit, right? But what most of you do not realize, in the accessibility-related context, UIKit is also a design language. Who of you has used custom controls on iOS? So, some of you. Did you try to mimic UIKit behavior? Yeah, and this is the right road. You should be doing this, because UIKit tries to impose on you some kind of uniformity. The uniformity that is being accepted and wanted by the accessibility-based crowd. So if only you use the custom controls, please follow the UIKit as much as you can. Because when you use our frameworks, you can always use the voiceover. And as I already said, most of them are by default supported by voiceover. And when you are working with storyboards and using the identity inspector, when you check the accessibility settings, you get this support, and you can, for example, make your artwork available via accessibility. But when we look at the screen, when we look at what we can define here, label will be the thing that accessibility users will hear from the screen reader, right? And there are some also other options. I would like you to be honest with this question. Has any of you used accessibility labeling for testing purposes? Do you use automatic test? Yeah, there was one man brave enough to admit that he has done so. And having seen what Mateusz went through, you know what happens then. If you use accessibility labeling for your testing, probably in the most automated way possible, because it's the most efficient way, the cheapest, the fastest, right? You put there some computery-like stuff, and Mateusz has to hear it then. So please keep in mind that labeling is for the user and identifiers are for you, right? It seems so obvious. It seems so obvious, but you would wonder how many of the developers do not follow this simple rule, right? So, two things to keep in mind. If you are using any artwork at all in your app, and you are not, at the moment, providing the accessibility features, please do enable them. Please enable this one switch. Provide the correct labeling for every artwork in your app that makes sense, right? And avoid anything else that's the decoration. Because if you're using your app in the curtain mode, or you simply cannot see the screen, you want to get only the meaningful information. You do not want to hear about the 20 pictures that are there just to look nice, right? So I would say that this is the first thing to keep in mind. Additional tip would be, have you noticed how the screen reader, how the voiceover reader interacts with Mateusz? It tries to read to him all the information that the nice developer would like to convey, but in a way that the person can clearly understand. Have you ever tried to use text-to-speech on iOS? Like to ask iPhone to read you an article, for example, or ask Siri about something. When you ask Siri, if you ask Siri to answer the question that brings up a very long answer, the way that she read it, especially on the previous versions of the iOS platform, was quite a challenge to be hearing, right? There was almost no punctuation at all. She went like a machine, naturally, right? And when you are a living person and you need to get the context, need to have something emphasized, you are dependent on the punctuation. So when you provide the labeling, please provide the punctuation, because then the screen reader will stop, will make a pause when there is a comma. If you provide, for example, a question mark, there will be a higher pitch in the screen reader voice. So the living person that gets the answer will get the context. And remember, we, people who do not use accessibility features all the time, we have so much of the context that we are not really aware of because we see it, right? We use it, it's so natural to us. Okay, this is how it looks from code. Just please let me change one thing. It will be more convenient for us all, I believe, with the code examples. We will naturally provide you with all the source code, but these are just the simplest examples, and we will naturally, for which is the I would say the default option. We would probably assume that as Apple trainers we will direct you to developerapple.com, right, to the concrete sessions. So treat this just as a little, very little demo. We will provide you with concrete numbering of sessions from the several years of the past that you can go throughout and get the whole context. Did you notice the play or pause button in the audio player app? Usually, when we implement the button, it has two states, like the on and off, toggled, right? But in the case of the play and pause button, which also has these two alternative states, we need to provide some changes to make the code more dynamic. We decided to use two images to represent the play and the pause icon, and it will be used for the selected or not state of the button. Whenever a user taps the button, we need to toggle the isSelected flag. So this part is not only for the accessibility-enabled crowd; it's only for the regular. It's also for the regular users. You have to check whether it's selected or not. But next, we would like to provide different accessibility labels for the accessibility-dependent crowd to be aware of the state of the app. And so this one here, and I lost my spotlight. This one here is the regular one. But when you look on at the end of this is the tricky part. Usually, VoiceOver can detect the type of element that is shown in the screen, and whenever there is a text or a button, it tries to provide additional information based upon the state of the element in a way that is relevant to this element, right? So for example, in the case of a button, it would like to emphasize that you are essentially clicking a button. So it would always say that it is a button, right? And whether this button has been selected or not. So you get two threads. It's a button, right? And it's selected or not. And now please do imagine a situation in which you have a matrix of, let's say, 30 buttons. And have you noticed how Mateusz went through the UI elements? He essentially went through each one of them, right? And if you would like to access the 20th of them, or the 25th of them, right, you have to go throughout the whole matrix, in most cases, right? And you know that they are buttons. You do not care, you know, from the other context, right? You just need to know whether it's selected or not, right? So keep in mind that you can modify the accessibility threads and choose the right ones in a given context, not to make all those people listening for 30th time that you went throughout the button, right? Because he probably knows that he goes throughout buttons in a matrix. Okay. Let's take a break for a moment and let's switch to our newest creation. Let's switch to voice control, which is somehow similar to the switch control. That's why the word switch is close to me, I guess, in this example. These people generally is not being designed for visually impaired crowd. It's designed for people with motor problems. So if you can't, for example, move your mouse or use the trackpad, you can use the interface via your voice. And basically, a user can control their device just with the voice. Have you seen Blade Runner? And the scene when he just defines the square and then just zoom in, describe it in a bit more detail. So voice control, essentially, when it's being used by the person who is really skilled in this, it looks like a Blade Runner demo, sorry, because we do demonstrate and not demonstrate, right? Okay, so by speaking aloud the actions that should be taken, you can direct the interface of the OS to take the actions that are necessary for you. And this is a pretty magical experience. But I use this example because it gets the same APIs that VoiceOver. So for example, if you do some really basic stuff for VoiceOver, voice control will pick it up immediately. So maybe let's go with a demo. A demo.
Do we need microphone? Maybe we'll try to enhance the sound of the phone.
She will be the sound.
I don't need to touch the phone, and there will no feedback actually. So okay, that's better. Okay, so let's start with that. Open audio player. Okay. Show names.
As you can see, it reacts immediately.
Yeah. So we have again show names. We can see the accessibility labels here. So for example, try to tap play button. Tap play. Okay. Increment volume. Increment volume.
Notice the slider.
Yeah, so slider is moving. And go home. Go home.
The last one was tricky, right? But essentially, when you provide the labeling for VoiceOver screen reader, voice control picks it up immediately. So as I said before, even if you before address the visually impaired crowd, now you are also giving additional superpowers to people having problems with motor skills. And in this way, it works throughout all of the OSs. So if you focus on one of the technologies, very often you get the more advanced features of the other ones. Okay, so pretty impressive, but there is more. Let's now check how VoiceOver, by using the bleeding edge technologies, you probably all have heard about machine learning, Core ML, and all this stuff that Apple is currently pushing very heavily forward. I don't know if you have noticed, but machine learning on our devices changes the way that people interact with our products and with your applications. Very often, in our community, especially in Poland, because I'm a bit immersed in our community, personally, I would say. I love podcasting. Mateusz is also recording a podcast, so we are, the podcasting crowd. We interact with our users. When the new iPhone comes and Apple presents you with all this super computing power that we deliver in the new box, for example, in the iPhone 11, how much faster is it than the previous model? Some of the folks in the community say, whatever. It was already pretty fast enough. I won't see a difference. And I would say that Apple does not agree with that. I personally also do not agree with that. But when you are an accessibility using person, each processing power increase widens the reach of the technology that you are depending on. So let's proceed with a photo handling app. Very simple photo management app. We will use our own Hipshare as an example. And please, if you go to the App Store and buy it during the next 15 minutes, do not depend on the version that is there, right? One could think why a person having vision problems would like to use the photo management app, right? It's all about seeing the photos. And in most cases, they will not be seeing the photos, or the most of them anyway, right? So why should they use photo management apps? And let's go with Hipshare. Hipshare was created like 4 years ago, I believe, when Apple introduced iPhone 6s and iPhone 6s Plus devices. And these devices came with technology called 3D Touch that brought to us the pick and pop mechanism in the UI that has been recently replaced, let's say it like this, with iOS 13, right? And Apple also, I don't know if you remember that, introduced live photos, the great feature of the live photos, but especially at the beginning, users of the other platforms, for example, when they wanted to exchange with our users the live photos, they wanted a mechanism to convert them, right? So we created this basic little app. We wrote it in like a couple of hours. We called it Hipshare, and it enables you to convert the live photo into an animated GIF or GIF, depending on the crowd, right? So we've got this little app, and let's look how it behaves by default, using only the default behavior of the OS. Okay? So can Jolanta and Mateusz launch Hipshare?
Okay. 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 Hipshare. Version. First version. This application is not accessibility because when I use VoiceOver, can I not any do in application, because all button and other content is not accessibility for me in this application. Okay, and I want 1 moment, and I want presented second version, Hipshare,
The enabled one.
enable one, and this 1 moment. This version, Hipshare, is good accessibility for VoiceOver and blind people, because in this version I can use this application, use button in application, and show photos with view VoiceOver, and hearing description about photos.
And this is the crucial part. You can hear the description of what's in the photo. And with each generation of our hardware and of the more processing power, our machine learning mechanisms is more and more powerful and precise. So for example, do yourself a favor and do yourself a little demo. Launch an camera app on your iPhone and enable accessibility. And if you even have two models, like the brand new iPhone 11 and, for example, the iPhone 10 or the previous generations, and try to find the difference when you enable the accessibility in the camera app and you make the device facing the same thing. Like if I were enable my iPad to describe what it's seeing here, it would probably say that it's a pretty lit up room with lots of people. It may even say that there are dark gray chairs in here, right? But if you launch the same thing on the previous generation of the device, the description would not be so powerful, so precise. It would just say like a lot of people in here, right? So what I'm going after is that our devices learn about the environment that they do live in, and then they can describe the surroundings for people who cannot see. And this uses the conjunction of those both of those technologies that we do provide, of the Core ML and the accessibility-related features that empower VoiceOver. Okay. So the only thing that developer really needs to do, because we have already heard before that by default we do not support any graphics, right? You have to enable the support. You have to set the is accessibility element to true, and in that way iOS will provide the user of your app with the description of the content that is currently selected or visible on the screen. VoiceOver will read information like the number of people, the object types visible in the photo, and very often the quality of the photo. So for example, when the blind person has 2 or 3 photos of the same thing, the device can guide them to use the best one, the one that looks the sharpest, right? And they wouldn't tell. But if they want to share the photo, they will share the right one, right? If you ever has like a spare 5 minutes, please visit accessibility site and watch the commercials. In the commercials, Apple very often presents this camera feature, and it's really, really powerful. Okay, so just to speed things up, and in a more point-by-point examples, keep in mind that besides the graphics, besides the labeling, you have to provide the concrete and correct navigation. When it comes to navigation, there is always a problem of the incorrectly represented hierarchy. And maybe if I can just switch to you, Jolanta, and if you could present the mobilization app.
Okay.
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 To show folks the hierarchy.
Okay. Mobilization application.
This is our little app presenting you the schedule for mobilization for today's event. And at first, we present you with the way the app will be generated for you automatically. And please take a look at how Mateusz interacts with the app.
This app is a lot of problem for blind user, because VoiceOver has a lot of problem interactive with this interface. Please look.
Look at what's being scrolled, what happens, what interaction happens in the screen. Is the user really informed about the changing values visible in the lower part of the screen, or not? Or are only being read the descriptions of the images in the top of the screen? And when you are a person not dependent on the accessibility, like a person with a sight, right, with the correct sight, do you really care about the image? Or are you going after the information that most probably should be updated? So if you do not provide, if you do not describe the hierarchy of your app in a way that conveys the context for the user, and not the context that should be used by the person with sight, because he or she will make it. They will see what happens on the screen, right? Then you will go through the hierarchy provided you most usually by the default, and at first you will go throughout the images, like in here, and you can, in fact, define the hierarchy yourself. So maybe let's continue with the improved demo.
Okay.
In the second version, we are just describing the hierarchy of the elements in a more convenient way when you have to go throughout with the swiping gesture. So, as you can see, we are no longer swiping the whole content and focusing on the graphics, but we do go through all of the screen, and when there is a labeling, like the room in which you have the speech, and the time the speech begins, and the time the speech ends, we do group them in a correct way. So, for example, the voice reader will the screen reader will tell you room number 201, for example, starting at 12 o'clock. Provided by Mateusz and Jolanta, right? And if you didn't provide the concrete hierarchy, you would be you would have heard something like place, author, starting, ending, and then in the corresponding way, room 201, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and Mateusz. So you have to keep all of this in mind when you do not see the screen, that at first it read room, then it read who provides, then when it starts, then when it ends. And you get the answer in this order. 201, Mateusz and Jolanta, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock. Okay. But it's not really convenient. You should group them to have the concrete labeling and the values So in room 201, provided by Mateusz and Jolanta, starts at 12, ends at 1. Okay? And now let's show you some hardware stuff that probably you are not using on a day-to-day basis. Have any of you used the Braille device when providing the iOS accessibility support?
Okay.
And that's a pity. And that's a pity.
One moment.
When you look at the Braille device, each of the sections represent a single character. A single character on the screen. Have you ever used 8-bit computers, like Commodore 64? How many of you used Commodore 64? Do you remember this great resolution, this text resolution of 40 characters on the screen? This is essentially this one, right? And when you provide the texts or labeling in your app, no matter of the platform, is it iOS, is it iPadOS, is it Mac, right?
Yes.
Some of these texts are being represented in this way. So you need to provide the text in a correct way. You need to provide all these non-printable characters. Are you familiar with this on-screen non-printable characters, like non-breaking spaces? You do. So in accessibility, there are equivalents for this.
Okay.
Yep. Go on.
Okay. When I use these apps, good version apps, can I changing pages in interface? And VoiceOver tell me which page, and I read other information about events on speech option, VoiceOver option, but I can use special devices, Braille devices, which show me in Braille text on these devices. Okay. And I can use these apps and read all information about event.
If you were to say whether you are quicker to get the content if you read it or if you hear it, like read it with your eyes, which route would you find the faster one? Who is with the eyes? Naturally. And this is the way to enable accessibility-based users to get your content faster, because they also have to do their work. They also have to live their lives. They do not have all the time in the world to spend waiting until our labeling from the developer resources goes through, for example, or our broken hierarchy will be read to them. So please keep in mind this hierarchy stuff, these non-breaking characters, and do yourself a favor, and your company a favor, and your users most of all a favor. And if you are invested in accessibility stuff on our platforms, do test this stuff with Braille readers. Okay?
Okay.
So usually we would also go throughout the code examples, but since I'm a quite talkative person and we are already behind with the time, I will just say that there will be some coding examples in the presentation that we will provide you with, but here we will have to stop, and if you have any questions, answer them here or outside the room. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I want to ask you how the design process of the accessibility labels looks like. Is it a part of UX the process or the development process?
In the organization.
Yeah.
And you ask about the most popular model.
Yeah, yes.
Okay. So maybe because I'm the talkative and going over the time person, I will ask to answer the question Jolanta. Jolanta, as I mentioned, is an Apple certified trainer. Can we have a microphone for her? Jolanta is an Apple certified trainer for Swift development tracks, and I believe she's the one who provided the largest amount of trainings in Poland and the larger area of Central Europe for Apple. So maybe you could answer the
So
question.
I believe the answer is it depends. And I'm afraid that very often the case is that we, as developers, need to figure out how to do things. Like, basically, there is a whole stack of UX related to accessibility, like the navigation and so on. And from my experience, it's not really common to get this insight from like the designer, and you would need to go with that for your own. And it's really hard, as you already see, as you heard that it's kind of hard to a person who can see everything on the screen, just to limit yourself to imagine what you could hear. And in the ideal world, basically, you would get the copywriter to provide you with the messaging, just like for other part of your app. But yeah, it's easy when you can just use the things that are displayed on the screen, but not so easy to use things that are not visible, like the buttons and so on. So just a few things to keep in mind. Remember about the punctuation. It's very, very important just to not concatenate things in a way that they are not understandable, about that there are like two pieces of information. And the other one is that you should also localize your accessibility labels. So if you, for example, support multiple languages, you should, in general, provide localized version of the accessibility labels as well. So you need to have some additional resources of the translators to do that. But unfortunately, I would be happy to work with that kind of team, but I don't believe it's very, very common to get a designer who is really aware. I think that for topics like dynamic type, it's much easier. Apple is very focused on, say, every single developer and every single designer. If you ever met a person from Apple talking about the design, you can be sure that there will be information that you need to support dynamic type.
Yeah.
Always. And I believe that for these topics and some visual things like high contrast and things like that, it's getting better. For voiceover, I think we need some more time to get the better understanding on how it works and to get actually support for people who should help us. Because as developers, we are not always very good at UX. Some of us are, but not all of us. So it would be great to have help from a professional. So yeah, it's kind of chance to you if you feel that you could learn these things very well, because you can get some expertise in a niche actually. But yeah, I wouldn't assume that in a typical case you get support for this UX thing. Maybe rather from the accessibility users like Mateusz, who can provide you with some feedback, but not really a person who would design it for you from the scratch. So yeah.
Okay, to sum it up, just 4 points. I'm the talkative person, we just add them, right? 4 points to keep in mind. There was a reason I asked you to use the curtain mode. Use the curtain mode. Use the braille reader. Ask for help for person who lives with this, right? Who lives and breathes. And we already mentioned, as we have to do always, the developer Apple.com, developer resources. But there is one more thing that you should keep in mind, and I believe that in our region, in EMEA, so Europe, Middle East, India, and Africa, and especially in Central and Eastern Europe, it's not so popular. But do keep in mind that Apple does provide certified training. And there are 2 parts of the certified training. You can learn more by visiting training.apple.com, but there are 2 parts of it. There is the certified paid track that you have to pay to attend, things like that, the regular way the things do go, right? But especially in our region, there are quite often free webinars for developers. So as far as I know, there have been like 2 or 3 recently related to this topic, to how design interfaces for Apple platforms with the proper design and accessibility handling. And it was probably even delivered by the trainers from this area. So besides this curtain mode, braille reader, and asking for help and getting larger teams, and besides going to developer.apple.com, go to trainingapple.com and look for webinars related to this topic specifically. Okay, thank you.